that works. Does look as though it's working. Excellent.
Great. And we're going to start. So first of all, we want to say thank you to Tamsin. Tamsin, oh my God, your patience and perseverance and kindness in coordinating this talk that was extended from last year. And I saw Rianka Singh's talk the other day, and I know we've all been looking forward to this for a couple of years. And we also want to thank the rest of the conference crew for making this possible. And we're in the West End of Toronto, and we sure wish you were all here with us, and that we were going to go for a happy hour after this. Tamsin already read our talk title, so I guess I won't read it out again. But obviously we added the last part of the title within the last 48 hours or so. Just in terms of accessibility, we want to give a visual description of ourselves. So I'm TL, and I have long dark hair that's kind of curly. I have Dutch ancestry, so I have a really huge forehead. I'm wearing red lipstick, bright red lipstick, big chunky glasses. I'm wearing a denim shirt that has like silver buttons on it. Some rings, some nail polish. I'm kind of femme looking. You can't tell this, but I'm 6 feet tall. And I think that's it for my description. Oh, I'm also white, sorry. I'm a white femme queer.
And I'm Jazz, and I have brown hair that is short-ish and extremely messy. I have white, pale, freckled skin.
You're wearing a black t-shirt.
I'm wearing a black t-shirt, got glasses.
We both have arm tattoos that might come up, and I think that's it. And we're sitting very close to each other on the same couch.
Oh, yeah.
And so this is the yellow couch of collaboration.
It is very that. And for visual description of our slides are text heavy in a very hodgepodge of PowerPoint generated designs. They're, we could say, aesthetically eclectic. We're going to read the text aloud and do our best to describe anything pictured on the slides that's not actually part of the text. So we live in Toronto, which has been a site of cosmopolitan and international activity for over 15,000 years. In fact, now it's more like 25,000 years that archaeologists have dated. And we try to learn from and honor relationships forged and ongoing here. This is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe Mississaugas of the Credit, Ojibwe peoples, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and Wendat peoples, and is continuously home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. It's an agreement between Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples to share and care for the area around the Great Lakes region, running all the way up the St. Lawrence River towards Montreal. This agreement was violated through several iterations of the Toronto Purchase, starting around 1787, again in 1805, and continuing in the 2010 settlement. And we live with and in this violation. As guests or uninvited visitors in these lands, we want to imagine and practice ways of being good guests, of orienting our work and priorities in the direction of and in support of those who have cared for the area and these lifeways for thousands of years. So to begin with the land acknowledgement, we're also acknowledging and highlighting the continued and future existence, relations, knowledges, and resistances of Indigenous peoples and nations in spite of centuries of colonial violence, and our commitment to being accountable to these histories as white settlers and to working within anti-colonial politics, cultural, economic, and intellectual frameworks in the present for the futurity of a less colonial and Indigenous-led future. This is also an acknowledgement of the context from which contemporary research norms in Canada have emerged and settled. Acknowledging our lives as white settlers have been shaped by anti-Indigenous racism and colonial violence, land theft, and ongoing cultural appropriation and attempted destruction, as well as other forms of white supremacy, shapes the priorities and directions of our academic work. We hope that this work is part of the important, heavy process of helping to break the habits of domination that are normalized through settler colonial logics. And we hope that our lives beyond our research and academic work support and contribute to Indigenous-led land return, reparation, and transformation.
So we realize that for many people listening from around the world, we'll describe this, actually, let's describe this slide right now.
Yeah.
So this slide is made by nativeland.ca, so native-land.ca. And this is a picture that shows Indigenous territories and treaties in and around the area of the Toronto Purchase. And it's in lots of different kind of watercolor layers to show the different territories and treaties and the overlappingness, and it does a nice job of kind of showing the interrelationship that is also signified by the dish with one spoon treaty. And then we've drawn a black arrow that points towards where we are, which is in the area around Toronto in the Toronto Purchase Treaty. So that's what our slide looks like. So we realize that for many people listening from around the world, the context of settler colonialism in Canada might not make much sense to our international audience. However, we believe that by each of us locating ourselves within these difficult material contexts, we might all build together an understanding of how global research and communication norms have, to a great extent, been part of the system of values and practices that justify the ongoing domination of some people over others, including ongoing imperialist, colonial, and industrial occupation, and settler occupation and colonialism. Additionally, and this is around the world, right? Additionally, in the seemingly placeless space of online classes, conferences, and gatherings, it's easy to abstract our relations with the lands where we are, the lands and communities that consensually or non-consensually host and absorb the infrastructures of digital culture, of the international communications and media infrastructure. So the mines, factories, server farms, data centers, call centers, and the content management labor, digital debris, and the atmospheric toxicity created by the technologies that make it possible for us to gather here today. The abstraction of lands in place as we increasingly inhabit a placeless and every place world makes it even more difficult for people living under conditions of settler or industrial colonialism and occupation to make claims to land sovereignty, and it makes it easier to erase or justify these ongoing violations, as our current abstraction of place mimics the doctrines of terra nullius that justified the imperialist and colonial invasion and occupation in the first place.
Okay, here's a slide listing what we're talking about today. So first, we're talking about acknowledging the Indigenous territories where we live and from where we come. And then we're talking about the digital research ethics, onto what is the Feminist Data Manifesto, what is FEMAD, who do we learn from, and into heavy processing and checking in, what we're thinking of as a trans feminist and queer anti-colonial digital research method. And then we may talk about Bad Art Friend. This could be a participant action section. We're wondering if anyone in the room is as obsessed with Bad Art Friend discourse emerging since the weekend's publication of the New York Times Magazine story as we are. It's entirely optional. Not everyone needs to have read that or care about it.
And if not, lots of people have read about it. It's totally fine. It's totally like US North American centric. And it's just like, it's, and so don't feel like we have to talk about that. We've got lots of other things to talk about. Okay, so we begin by posing 3 questions that orient our research. 1, what if the ethical and evaluative structures of academic research and artistic practice did not normalize systems of exploitation? Imagine. 2, can the current moment of digital research methods in formation, which is a shout out to Beyonce, obviously, offers us an opportunity, does this offer us an opportunity to answer the first question? And finally, in particular, what can transfeminist and queer methods like the heavy processing method of checking in that we propose here bring to critical data studies to move us towards more ethical methods for digital research in communication and media studies? So some of you may be familiar with the next slide. So I'm going to describe what it is. So it's a famous 1993 New Yorker cartoon, which satirizes online anonymity by featuring two dogs at a desktop computer with the caption, "On the internet, nobody knows your dog." So one dog is talking to the other dog. Similarly, the current Canadian research ethics policy might be summarized as, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a researcher." And so what we've done in my very amateurish internet art is that I have just crossed out the word dog and replaced it with the word researcher using the same dog cartoon. So while academics have recognized ethics protocols for engaging with human research subjects, as well as accepted methods for participant observation, ethnography, and the recognized need for deep cultural context, the uniquely accessible and seemingly public nature of online communities has allowed researchers to observe with no burden of responsibility for being observed or reciprocal relationship to those they are observing. That is, with few exceptions, scholarly publications have been largely silent on the topic of evolving ethical considerations required for the internet as a site of research, a publication venue for scholarly research, and the production of cultural archives. In effect, current digital research ethics in Canada encourage researchers to peek, as Dana Boyd puts it, lurk, mine, and claim digital materials with abandon, as long as they don't anyone that they are researchers. This allows for behaviors that have long been considered unethical and dishonest in online culture. And so, if you've read and been obsessed with Bad Art Friend, this is where we might come in.
And I think that in the chat, I see everybody's like, yeah, it's all over my Twitter, but I can't get past the paywall. So, I mean, that's the thing.
Oh, okay, I should post a PDF of it. It's too long to read now, but we can summarize.
So I have a slide up here of the homepage of Canada's Tri-Council policy statement on the ethical conduct for research involving humans. And doesn't say much on the homepage. If you scroll down, it would, and it indicates that research in Canada in the humanities, social sciences, health sciences, as well as hard sciences, are exempt from research ethic board review if the research involves, quote, information in the public domain that may contain identifiable information and for which there is no reasonable expectation of privacy. One of the key elements of the Tri-Council policy for REB, Research Ethics Board exemption, is that the research project is, quote, non-intrusive and does not involve direct interaction between the researcher and individuals through the internet. However, by effectively encouraging researchers to conduct their research without direct involvement with the creators and producers of the digital materials that they collect, this policy fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of socially produced digital content, which requires, quote, time in a community and be embedded within it, as Zainab Tufekci points out in a 2014 article. In offline environments where face-to-face research takes place, researchers would typically be required to receive REB approval to study people and communities, and they may do so by receiving consent, building trust, and developing understandings of reciprocity. In contrast, online archives and commercial social media platforms offer researchers access to otherwise inaccessible communities without the hassle of REB applications or undergoing the process of directly receiving consent from the people they want to study. Moreover, the current lack of robust digital research ethics protocols in Canada can result in significant misrepresentations of cultural events, decontextualized communication codes and community-generated knowledges, and contribute to demonization, devaluation, and general dis and misinformation about minoritized peoples' knowledges and cultural practices. Canada lags behind countries like Norway, which is actually one of the only countries in the world which has developed federal internet research guidelines that take into consideration, quote, the contextual integrity of online privacy. In Norway's national guidelines for research ethics in the social sciences and humanities, they indicate that ethics guidelines are living documents that account for the impossibility of a one-size-fits-all digital research ethics. In our larger work, we also look to the long-term work done by the ethics committee at the Association of Internet Researchers that's been encouraging this move for some time, though with a slightly different emphasis than ours. In his research on the ethics of data mining Tumblr posts by transgender youth, Jack Giesking highlights the potential for misrepresenting trans youth's experiences and calls for caution and deep context when using, quote, a data set of living individuals. So I've got a slide up here that is from an article that Jack Giesking published on our blog, the Digital Research Ethics Collaboratory, entitled Privacy in Public, Visualizing the Lives of Transgender Youth Through Tumblr Posts. And it's got a kind of L-word style data visualization where many points of data are connected to each other with some parts sort of
all the names
blacked
are
out.
excised, yeah.
Yeah, what is that?
Redacted.
Yes, names redacted. The gap in scholarly ethics protocols has especially hazardous consequences for already vulnerable, targeted, and minoritized populations, as Giesking points out, and as we continue to pursue. It's well established that minoritized people, including women, trans feminist, queer people, and people of color, are disproportionately targeted for online threats and harassment. And yet, as the scholarly fields of trans studies, queer, sexuality, gender studies, disability studies, indigenous, critical race, and ethnic studies remind us, the term minoritized refers to distinct populations who may not be in the minority at all. Indeed, together form the majority population in most places, but whose unique knowledges, cultural practices, histories, and socialities have been consistently undermined, dismissed, and rendered insignificant or troubling to the imagined majority. These are the knowledges, cultural practices, histories, and socialities that our work prioritizes. People whose lives and materials have been the subject of research are often experts in what digital research ethics ought to be in order to prioritize their needs and concerns. However, this expertise is not the basis of Canada's governing protocols. For example, Canada's National Research Ethics explains, I don't think that the transcription is on. Oh, it's not on ours, okay, but it's on theirs. Okay. Much research offers little or no direct benefit to participants. In most research, the primary benefits produced are for society and for the advancement of knowledge. So that's the end of quote. We and our collaborators are concerned with the ways that digital research environments exacerbate and intensify the longstanding scholarly tendency to undervalue and sacrifice the interests of research participants in order to prioritize the supposed interests of society and knowledge, or art, if we're thinking about bad art friend, which also tend to correspond with the needs of the researcher and the research institutions over the needs of research people and communities.
So Jamie Nesbitt Golden and Monique Judge, in their blog post, What Happens When a Journalist Uses Your Tweets for a Story, they highlight the increased risk of being targeted for harassment and other violence when a journalist or researcher recirculates a person's social media content beyond its intended audience and context and without permission. They write, what many of these journalists fail to grasp is that a person tweeting to a small audience may very well understand the public tweets are subject to being shared and seen by a larger audience. But the type of exposure that comes when a larger media outlet shares your story in no way compares to the 100 people on your timeline retweeting your tweet. That's from 2015. In the absence of contextual understandings of user consent in an era of compulsory online sociality, and that's from Melissa Gregg as well as others, ubiquitous computing, networking, and social media connectivity, and the impossibility for most of us to opt out or refuse commercial platforms' terms of use and ethics agreements. And this is a compulsory situation furthered by COVID-19 self-isolation and remote working measures. So we need to develop ethics and methods that take critical questions of coercive platform protocols into serious considerations. Research protocols that simply piggyback on commercial platform protocols let researchers off the hooks while putting most Canadians and others at risk, for they have no choice but to post information about their own lives online in order to participate in professional and public culture. In August 2019, we were invited by Marika Seafor and Patricia Garcia to join the Feminist Data Workshop, a seminar awarded and supported by the Institute for the Research on Women and Gender at the University of Michigan. Along with other feminist and critical race scholars of data cultures, politics, and economies, Tanya Sutherland, Anna Lauren Hoffman, Jasmine, Anita Say Chen, Nilufar Salehi, Jennifer Rault, and Lisa Nakamura, we happily took part in 3 days of conversations, which culminated in us all spending an extra half day together making a first draft of the Feminist Data Manifesto. And we were going to put the link in the chat, but I seem to have lost it. Oh, there it is. I don't know how to do that. Just okay.
But we've got a slide up.
We've got a slide up. Okay, so the slide is just the landing page of the Feminist Data Manifesto. It's a page that was made in Squarespace, and so it's built on a kind of block editing template with Feminist Data Manifest No in capital letters at the top in red, and then just in black print on a white background is just the beginning of the Feminist Data Manifesto as a declaration of refusals and commitments. So both the days leading up to this collective and collaborative writing, and in the months following, we rewrote and co-wrote the manifesto. And in the months following its launch in November 2019, we did a lot of processing, a lot of talking about what would make it into the manifesto, how it would be structured. We clarified what we meant by talking, writing things out, and then talking and writing into each other's words as we drafted and redrafted some more. Reorganized and using the collaborative creation process, not just as a conduit through which we got our ideas clearly on the page, but also as a process of iterative design and theory building, coming to our ideas and changing them as we worked on them together. Together, we wrote 30 paired statements, each with a conscientious refusal of a mode of contemporary data racial capitalism and a commitment to a FEMAD, a feminist emergency and emergent method and action on or against data. And we kind of reverse engineered FEMAD. It was like, I came up with that after we had already done it, but it was based on the work we did with the manifesto. So we want to read a couple of the statements from the manifesto to give you a sense of what we were up to. And we thought we would paste the link in the chat, but it's just manifestno.com. In point 26, we refuse to accept that data only matters when it's big, abstract, digital, aggregated, machine readable, and instrumentalized for the market. We commit to valuing other forms and materialities of data that privilege accountability and legibility to users and community, and examine data at and across all of its scales. And point number 15, or the 15 statement, we refuse systems that simplify consent into a one-time action, a simple click of a yes to a terms of service agreement to ownership of our data in perpetuity. We commit to enacting Planned Parenthood's FRIES model of consent that ensures that it is always given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. I think maybe you talk now.
We have a slide up right now that offers the full definition of the FRIES consent from Planned Parenthood that's used by Una Lee and Dan Tolliver in their zine Building Consentful Tech. That is a beautiful little zine that you can download for free from and also to .net.
And it has like the words freely given, reversible, enthusiastic, retractable, and specific in brightly colored neon like shapes, kind of almost three-dimensional shapes that are part of the page.
This is a slide that introduces FEMAD. As a follow-up to the manifesto working group, we started a working group called FEMAD, the Feminist Emergency and Emergent Methods for Actions on and Against Data. And we started this with the McLuhan Center on Culture and Technology at University of Toronto. The group includes us, along with Jennifer Wemigwans, Tanya Sutherland, as well as the Feminist Manifesto co-authors and some of our colleagues at U of T and elsewhere. Right now, what we're doing with these emergency and emergent methods are things like gathering. I have a slide up that indicates some of the things we're doing with FEMAD in different colored boxes. The text reads, gathering in small groups of trans feminists and queers to read each other's writing, to check in on each other, to slow down, to catch up with each other, even though we're behind on most of our projects. And we need these slow gatherings and check-ins because we're also paying attention to our students and working with them as they make their way through their degrees in these difficult circumstances, caring for family members, building, maintaining, reinforcing community support networks within our queer worlds. Paying attention to the ways that our data bodies are hailed and tracked as we negotiate strategies to opt out of or concede by compelled necessity and submit to the many online platform data mines that structure our lives, social media sites, online teaching platforms, online entertainment like streaming services, fully online medical care, including medical doctors, therapists, and other practitioners, and COVID tracking apps and health resource aggregators. Building relationships with the people who we are working with, having conversations about the institutional practices and data logics into which we are implicated. And the most important thing that we've learned about data management in creative research, and really what research is not creative, is that relationships come first. That is, building good relationships is the only way to generate good data, the only way to understand how that data should be managed, and the only way to cultivate good creative research. The method, or FEMAD, that we use for building and maintaining good relationships is heavy processing, our book length refusal of dominant mega methods, fast methods, anonymous methods, and our commitment to building relationships of trust and reciprocity with our research participants and communities, with our students and colleagues. One of the tricky problems with using a feminist model of consent is that it can hyper-individuate the moment of permission and does not leave a lot of room for questions of collective and relational consent. Indigenous data and digital studies have been leading the field, generating methods that foreground the sociality of data and consent. For example, data only makes sense in its social, cultural, political context, and no one person owns it. Our next slide is from the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and there's a graphic that is a great image that looks like a mix of weaving and sort of motherboard electric circuit that introduces the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. And this is an augmentation of open data principles to be in good relations with Indigenous data sovereignty. Your data should demonstrate Indigenous collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. These principles are often at odds with and improve on the existing international scholarly push for data to be fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I recommend that you look up GIDA, Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and check out what they have to say about these FAIR principles. The next principles that have been really central to thinking through better data practices are from Kim Kristen's work with Indigenous communities on data collection, storage, and curation. And she introduces the idea of ethics as an acronym for engage, talk, help, invest, create, and support. And each one of these is sort of thoroughly explained in ways that we decided not to go into too much here, but you can read in Kristen's essay, Relationships, Not Records, from 2018, highly recommended. These are some of the critical data ethics and methods that we learn from and draw upon as we work towards our own research protocols. So in our title for today's talk, Putting the Base in Database, or one of the many parts of our title, TL loves a long title.
And an acronym.
We're invoking the very unfashionable base superstructure metaphor introduced by Marx to draw attention to the ways that data and databases are products of social relations and material conditions of labor. And to ensure that we're collecting, creating, and sharing better data, analyzing and making better sense of data, we need to reconsider the conditions of its production and circulation. This is a question of methods, and we've been working on heavy processing as a materialist methodology that explains not only how one pursues a research question, but how and why one comes to that question in the first place. Over the past several years, we've been practicing and theorizing a collaborative method for working on digital materials that at first we characterized as process heavy or micro-processing, where process is product. Let's get that. Process generates knowledge, and it allows us to understand our own place within and outside the research we're doing. Process is a form of experimentation. It's a method. It's a way of learning, of gathering and sharing information, of knowing. We've been jokingly calling this the lesbian method of heavy processing. This is usually good for a knowing insider chuckle or two. The queers in the room might pay a little more attention, might see that we're talking to and about them. Recently, we've been taking our joke very seriously.
And for anyone who's interested, you can go to dreccollab.org or just Google the Digital Research Ethics Collaboratory, and we have 3 of the chapters of our book posted there. And the book is coming out next year, hopefully with Punctum. We've come to thinking about heavy processing as a desiring, pleasurable, and hardworking set of attachments and sensibilities to relationship-based complex knowledge formation, a kind of socio-political, ethic, epistemological heavy petting and heavy lifting, if you will, and reflecting on the ways that this method is formed and informed by a long history of transfeminist and queer, what we call TFQ, practices and information technologies. Of course, lesbians do not own processing or process-based approaches to knowledge formation, transfer, and cultural surveillance, survivance, also surveillance, to data, ethics, and ontology. But we want to stay with the possibilities here for understanding process as a sexy, sometimes agonized, but always committed method, an orientation towards unruly information. This is processing not only to get consent, to communicate care, to clean your data, to publish your findings, or to move to the next agenda item on the meeting, but as an orientation to the pleasure, the sexual, emotional, political, intellectual pleasure of complex and sometimes incommensurate information. Of course, heavy processing is also at the heart of so many colonial extraction economies, mining and refining petrochemicals from and on stolen indigenous lands, poisoning lifeways for decades past and future, and transnational agricultural economies, patenting and monopolizing seeds, fertilizers, and insecticides, and so on, to create transnational monocropping to heavily process into cheap sugars and oils for low nutrient foods. However, in the same way that lesbians do not own processing, neither do multiple multinational corporations. So let's just go with the lesbian processing. A central practice of heavy processing is the method of checking in. Here we propose what so many activist scholars, community organizers, and artists are also proposing in one way or another, that before you can identify your protocols, your ethics, or your methods, you need some heavy processing, a lot of checking in. You need listening and talking and asking for more information. Method might be understood as the procedures by which you go about your research or which tools you're using and how. So for example, what tools you're using for data collecting, for visualization softwares, for content management system, all of those.
Okay, process, especially heavy processing, allows us to come to understand which archives or data we want to collect in the first place and why. I've got a slide up that includes the text that I'm reading right now. Which bodies are attached to this data and whether the platform from which you are collecting it is evil, and does that matter? Why or why not? What kinds of a priori agreements and values are built into your chosen tools, and does that matter? Why or why not? What does this data or archive not tell you? For example, the context of who the data is attached to, and or what are the impacts of impacts of your research might be on the people who may or may not know that they are implicated in your research. Process is checking in multiple times during each stage of research or creation to reassess commitments, to find out if everyone still consents to participation, if the tools are good or just actually too evil, and if there's new information that we need to think about. We admit process is not great at deadlines and perhaps not even great at careers. But it works on reforming the base of material relations and working conditions that may allow us as researchers to invest in better relations, ask better questions, generate better, more accountable, and more generative knowledges. And now we want to end by asking you some questions. So we want to ask what kinds of heavy processing or checking in are or might be applicable to your research. What are the risks you would face and benefits you might gain if you practiced heavy processing or checking in your research? The other thing we were going to ask about, but I think this is the main thing that we want to ask about.
Yeah, but I think you should put the other one up and then we can stop sharing our slide. Yeah.
Okay.
So the third question, in case anyone has read it, and otherwise you can email us and we'll send you a PDF. Can we together create an alternate reality that incorporates a pre-publication checking in model for the bad art friend story that is making so many people quite obsessed? Where would a check-in have been useful, and what would it have? What would have been the risk of a check-in? And then, so then I think we want to go to the thank you slide, and I think maybe what I can do is just post the questions in the chat. Yeah, so we can.
Or basically, you know.
Yeah.
How might checking in help people's research or be a challenge?
Yeah.
Thank you. We do have a question in the chat, but what I was going to be selfish and perhaps ask a question first, if that's okay. So, you know, and it's more of a comment. I don't know, maybe it's not a question. So the kind of, and it leads back to that initial image that you had with the animals in front of the computer, the New York Times thing. So the hope with the internet is always that you can, in theory, be whatever you want. You could be a cat, you could be a researcher, you could be, I don't know, an Australian. But as time goes on, we see that that's not quite right? You know, there's a constantly, you have to reaffirm what your physical existence is in, you know, the real world. You constantly have to reaffirm that online. I can't even remember the name of the article, but it's a really great one about breast cancer forums where you have to you have to prove that you actually have breast cancer in order to be part of the forum, which is kind of goes against this initial hope that the internet had. And so I've seen a lot of work done on and then also along with that is data, which we assume has an authenticity to it because it's numbers, right? It's, you know, it's statistics, it's all this type of thing. And for researchers, that's, you know, that's gold. But then what happens, and this leads to your last point, which is heavy processing. What happens when we have people, and there's, I mean, I know, I mean, this is anecdotal, that there's a lot of people, specifically minorities, who purposefully give bad data, who purposefully, as an act of resistance, will, you know, give something that's not accurate. And so then how, as researchers, would you approach that? Because you do want to include these people in your research, but, you know, by definition, that they're skeptical, so they're you know, the simplest example is not giving your real name on Facebook, right? So I don't know, this is not really a question, like I said, it's a comment, but maybe you can say something to speak to it a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the practice of giving bad data is exactly a practice of refusal, and something that we would include as a kind of feminist data manifesto method of refusal and commitment to keeping that data for the researchers to whom it matters most. And the researchers to whom it matters most have to prove that it matters. They have to prove that they are trustworthy. They have to prove that somebody should give them clean data or good data, right? And so our whole call is, I mean, our whole sort of thought about this is indeed, we are increasingly, rightfully resistant of the constant data mining that feeds a particular kind of racial capitalism that's exacerbated and sped up by the onlining of so many of our services and socialities. And so as researchers, our work is so often relying on what's online and what we can scrape from what's online, but is also very often contributing to online, right? So we may be taking things that are already existing online or data that is on the backside of online, but we also may equally be taking things that are not online and putting them online. I think about many people creating archives, digital archives, to be able to make previously not online materials more accessible to larger publics. But all of that comes with these great risks, and we are finding this impasse where we're compelled to do it, both to take stuff from online and to put stuff online as researchers. In most of the research grants that you apply for, they're going to ask, what are your knowledge mobilization plans? And everybody loves an open publication or a website or something. So everybody loves researchers putting stuff more online. And then we have more and more and more research that's about grabbing things from social media, and all of the different kinds of information that can be grabbed from social media. And this seems to us to be an amping up of a long-standing set of colonial relations to research and knowledge production. So it's about extraction, and an extraction that will serve the career of a researcher and the profile of a university in all of these kind of larger and more abstract ways. And we're like, okay, how do we take this opportunity of this amping up to interrupt a trajectory that's been going on for a very, very long time?
It's complicated. Sorry, I'll go on to the questions in the chat. Claire, did you want to unmute yourself to maybe also ask your question, but then also consider the questions that Jazz and TL have put in the chat?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
there's no pressure to answer our questions. We just put that up there in case people didn't have things to say. Yeah. Hi, Claire.
Yeah. Hi. I'm so happy to be here today. Okay, actually, like my question, is kind of like connected with like the questions you guys have in the slide. So I'm just gonna ask. So like actually, personally, I also work with Twitter data a lot. And yeah, I'm talking about like billions of like millions of pieces of Twitter data, and like something that like is definitely striking me when I'm processing my data is that so I usually get my Twitter data from like Twitter APIs. It's just like basically what I got whatever Twitter gives me, and some like I feel some of the information they share is really too in detail. Like for example, I'll be able to access their like the profile picture of the like users, and following that, I would definitely be able to know like their ethnicity or their like gender, or like if I'm interested in that. So I'm just wondering, like I think it's so great there are so many initiatives going on in order to protect the privacy and like online safety of queers and like women. But I'm just wondering, do you think it'd be also necessary to kind of like impose or like targeting these initiatives not only towards researchers, but also like social media companies, like platforms like Twitter or Facebook, just because like practically we all get our data from them.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah. I know that Twitter and Facebook have like some terms of use or terms of service for researchers, but that's still kind of all those terms of service for researchers are still kind of wrapped up in their general approach to user data and to the overall the logics of a kind of free data and open data. And so I think for me, obviously it makes sense for us to think critically about what is available. As you're saying, like you're like, I know so many people who do mining data like you're talking about, or mining research, and they see what they get and they're like, this is too much.
Definitely.
And so I think we need to be critical about that. And I think we need to start like being like publishing about what's too much in the materials that you're able to get from whatever script you're writing or whatever database you're purchasing or whatever it is. And so I think there could be a movement to make those kinds of that kind of research more selective in terms of what's available. And I also think that maybe in terms of service that people can, this isn't reliable because people just click accept and go on, but that people can click you know, what kinds of things could be available to something like a Python script or whatever it is, you know. But I think researchers, we can talk about this, but I also think that it is weirdly and very unfortunately, it's like when there's a problem, when there's a Twitter user or from some other social media platform whose material gets used in a bad way, then we get to, then we see the problems that emerge. And what happens is that so often academic research is not being read by the people whose material is being used for that research. So those folks don't even know how their material is being used. So I think for me also, like, if I think that researchers should be doing the accountable thing and posting their research on Twitter or wherever they're getting their stuff, and kind of tagging the terms that they're using, so that more folks who are using these platforms can see what kind of material is being generated from the data that they may or may not know is accessible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, definitely. Yeah, I also agree, like kind of like researchers ourselves, it's also like our responsibility to like make use of the data as safe as we could, given the
Yeah, and one of the things we often talk about on these questions of grabbing social media data is like what it would mean for you to publicize on Twitter the fact that you're using all of this, what you can, you know, what's available from the API, to indicate that you're getting too much information, right? To even just communicate over Twitter that, like, you know, watch out, your much more personally identifying materials is coming with this data dump and with this script, and also in that way to out yourself as a researcher, right? Because so much of what is striking us as dangerous is that researchers are more and more mirroring the logics of the platforms that we use, so that we're encouraged to grab more and more and more data, and basically sell it off for profit elsewhere. And our selling is processing it through analysis and whatever, and writing papers and maybe getting a degree and maybe getting a fellowship. And, you know, the profits are significantly lower than it may be for the ways that they're selling the data. But nonetheless, our research is rewarded for operating in a very similar way as these commercial platforms. And we like to try and imagine we hold ourselves to a higher ethical standard, and we have a larger sense of accountability than a company like Twitter. But our research economies and actually these big research questions, what kind of meaning is being made on Twitter, et cetera, are encouraging us to mimic the logics of these commercial platforms. So, right, how do you out yourself as a researcher? How do you identify that it's uncomfortable how much information you get? How do you try and ask for people whose information you may be using in your analysis, ask for them to weigh in on your research?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's often like so hard to actually like out myself to all the like potential participants of a researcher, because like I feel nowadays like the scale of participants is usually like literally millions of users. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
and just like in answering your question, so like something I do in just like very preliminary stage of in my research is I will just filter out the like several columns of the information I feel that is like too much to like to have like profiles and and like maybe birthdays and yes.
Yeah, that's a good move. But I can see that, right? It's making you uncomfortable to even have to, or you realize invasion of privacy to even have to erase all of that, right?
Yeah, I'm scared.
Well, thank you.
We do have, sorry to cut you off. We do have another question from Namit. Namit, did you want to unmute yourself to ask your question? Or
Yeah,
if not,
hi.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, there. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I must confess that this research study is very new to me. I'm still trying to understand, get a hold of the idea. But there's one aspect which interested me regarding the open data that you discussed about. And I would like to know what your opinion is in terms of how open data can impact the whole idea of trans, feminist, and queer critical data that you were discussing. Because in India, the core problem that we are facing in terms of open data is the fact that it largely remains incomplete. And as a result, the research becomes inconsistent. And I mean, that is one of the core issues that we are facing in regard to how open data can be utilized for a kind of a sound knowledge base and an action within society. So do you also face such challenges when you are kind of analyzing open data? And if so, then how this problem is getting addressed? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And, you know, I think for us, it's probably useful to clarify, right, that there's in Canada and in the US, there are a number of local, provincial, federal government open data initiatives. So that's about governments disclosing information about themselves. So that's one way. Then there's a more sort of open data movement about researchers making available their research results and sometimes their sort of core research materials, their data sets, etc. And we're coming in saying a lot of the time, whether it's government research or whether it's academic research working with data sets that they've collected, the information that is being made open belongs to people that have not been consulted. So on a really basic level, we're like, sure, open data would be great when it comes to research on, about, or involving trans, queer, working class, people of color, immigrants, indigenous people, refugees, right? It would be great to have open data. Making available the research as well as the research materials
and the research methodology.
But at the very beginning, before asking what should be made open, there needs to be a step that we're calling heavy processing, which is about a really fundamental effort to ensure that everybody who is being researched is consulted, it has opportunity to say, no, I don't want that information in there. No, that's a bad analysis. No, just leave me out of your research altogether. Or like Tamsin says, like, here's some bad data. Like, I'll give you some bad information. That there should be a step before putting everything out, as in putting everything online. The step before is ensuring that what is known in the most responsible, accountable, reciprocal way with the communities who are being researched. Does that make sense?
And I'm not sure if Nama can hear us, but we have another question from Michael. Michael, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question? I think you're there.
Sure. I can also kind of pause just to see if give Namat a chance to respond too.
Yes, I wasn't sure whether Namat was there, wanted to say anything.
Yeah, there's a slight network.
I think we might have a network connection problem there.
Ask the question. I'll try to reconnect again. There's a
okay. Okay, thank you, Namat. Michael, you could probably go ahead and then we could come back if we need to.
Okay, I'll try to make mine pretty quick. But I really appreciated this talk because it touched on ethics and research issues that I was getting a chance to talk to other colleagues about at this conference. So actually, just because they gave really helpful feedback, I wanted to shout out Kyle Napier and Eileen Beaver for sort of the suggestions they made for how to make my work more collaborative with other researchers. I guess maybe the broader question I had was kind of approaching media studies a little bit more from a kind of sort of literature and history of philosophy and history of science approach, where you're kind of working with and reinterpreting older texts and also trying to incorporate sort of perspectives that aren't sort of in the canon. How do you kind of square that with research that may or may not have been sort of gathered unethically? So I think especially thinking about my own kind of building syllabi for world literature or history of philosophy classes that are trying to decolonize the curriculum, but also say relying on anthropological data to communicate that sort of literature, history, or science. And especially since it's often older data as well. What are some of the ethical principles for engaging that? I also am pretty happy to accept that maybe it's that we refuse to use it. But I'm just kind of wondering, yeah, what kinds of thoughts that we have on that question.
That's a great question.
It's a totally great question. And I think for me, I would use the metaphor of literacy to think through this, and actually to think like a classroom is the best place for students to encounter that material, as long as what you're doing is, instead of like assigning like 6 essays in a class, actually assigning just, I would say, like, it's a pedagogical and methodological question as much as an ethical question. And obviously those things are all the same in my mind. But like thinking about literacy and training students to read those texts critically and to give them the analytic tools to think, okay, so this is published in 1874. I wonder, was this done appropriately? Was this reciprocal? Was this accountable? Was this consensual? And then to think about, like, okay, what does it mean? And to ask students, get students to answer those questions for themselves. Like, what does it mean to, sorry, my little light went off. What does it mean to, is there any value still to materials that have been collected unethically? Is there a way to repair that? Who would be the people to determine that? Who are the communities, the descendants of the communities of the people who were researched, and how are they interacting with that material?
And even data information that was collected unethically and in conditions of coercion and often outright violence. And even that really bad data can be extremely valuable to communities that are descendant, right? And so if you're related, if that's part of your ongoing social life and community and intimate familial and friend networks, then that bad data is going to mean a lot more to you than those of us who are outside of it just being like, oh damn, let's put this to bed, right? So I think about oh shit, I'm gonna be really bad at remembering the album that came out in Canada 2 years ago that won the Polaris Prize, that is using field recordings of Mi'kmaq people to repurpose for his own recording. You're looking at me like you don't remember, but
Is it
Jeremy Dutcher.
Yeah, Jeremy Dutcher. I was going to say, is it the opera one or the hip hop one?
The opera one. So Jeremy Dutcher does this. Dutcher does this really beautiful work of really unethically gained recordings of, right, the premise in the early part of the 20th century in Canada was that, oh, these languages are dying, right? So the genocidal logics were impelling all of these collecting practices. So there was these sound recordings of these songs and stories, and this musician is descendant and part of these communities, and heard these recordings in one of his ethnomusicology classes, and was like, oh wow, that I I have an active relationship to this. This has meaning well beyond the context of why it was collected or how it's stored or even how it's shared. And he took all of these field recordings and made a beautiful, beautiful album because he's also an amazing musician. And so repurposed it into some meaning that is well beyond what I would have ever been able to imagine. So I think teaching bad data practices is actually just like a brilliantly generative exercise.
And one more thing that I think about that we're more and more doing is, and I'm just trying to think of the, it's the end of my brain day. The name of the brilliant Black feminist poet who made a book called Citizen, is that what it is? And
what the hell is wrong with us? Claudia Rankine.
And I'm trying to also remember, someone else can help me with this, but one of the images that she uses is a photo that is her, I think it's her partner, who's a photographer, who has reproduced a photograph of a lynching of African-American men and taken the picture that the men out of the lynched men out of the photograph, and all you get is a picture of the white onlookers. And so the picture without the picture of those murdered men becomes just a picture of the spectacle of white violence. And one of the things I think about that as a method all the time for doing this kind of difficult research. And what I would say in terms of like the materials that you're thinking about is use it as an opportunity, not to study the people who've been studied in that article, but use it as an opportunity to study the researchers and the research methods. And so that, and like to kind of train students in that methodology. And the other thing I would say is like thinking about naming the class or naming the different sections of the class in ways that will inform students of potential triggers, you know, so to talk about like, you know, violent anthropological data, and like at the beginning of classes to say like the material that's here is, you know, race science. And that's really stuff. And so, you know, let students know that so much of the scientific knowledge we have about physiology, about biology, about intelligence, about all of those things is based on race science. And they need to be able to see it, to recognize it, so that when it creeps up again and again now, as it does, that they'll actually be able to call it out. And so I think that there's some real integrity in doing that work, but it takes a ton of work and patience. And even like, depending on who your students are and depending on what is available to you, like bringing in a counselor at the beginning of the class and saying, listen, this shit is traumatic. And for people who experience intergenerational trauma from this work, this is something that you may want to have conversations about. You may, if you're dealing with a lot of work that's about African Americans, you may want to create space with the African American counselor or colleague to have a space just for African American students to work through that shit without white observers. So it's, I think, just a kind of completely different pedagogical model that's nonetheless, I think, extremely important and transformative.
Yeah, it's a fun question.
Yeah, it's a really smart question, really smart thing that you're working on.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And it looks like we're come up on our time here. So I just wanted to say thank you both for this fantastic session. What I am going to do is we will put this recording in the event schedule so that people can watch this later. There is a discussion board attached. So if there's any other questions or comments, I can make sure you have those. Yes, thank you again. There's always that moment at the end of the session where I call it the Zoom wave. I'm sure other people do it too, where we have to do in lieu of actually going and having a drink together or going and continuing this conversation over coffee, which I know that we all want to do. We have to do this funny Zoom wave instead, but until a time when we can do that, I think that's what we'll have to do. But thank you again for a lot of you can't tell, but on my screen I've got a whole page of notes and things to go away and think about. So I really do appreciate that, and thank you both for making me think about those things. So we'll be in touch, and thanks so much.
Thank you, and thank you for thinking with us.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for coming at this time of day, wherever you are in the world. I'm sure there's other things you could be doing, and for people for whom it is that time of day, I wish you a wonderful happy hour, whatever is your choice.
Thank you
All
both.
right.
It is about that. Well, it's only 3 o'clock here in Illinois. Maybe it's not suitable yet, but we'll find someone who's had a good happy hour. Thank you both.
All right.
Thank you.
Take
Goodbye.
care, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for your great questions too. Bye.